Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of MIX. Hope everyone's having a good time in Vegas. And of course, for all of you who had a particularly good time last night, thank you for making it out to what I'm sure is your first session of the day. My name is Karen Corby. I'm a program manager on the Silverlight team. So how many folks have had a chance to play with Silverlight 1 in the audience? Hands? Okay. Just about everyone. Good job. How many of you guys noticed that there weren't actually any controls in Silverlight 1? Yeah, roughly the same number. So I'm sure that you guys all enjoyed making your own button and making your own list box. And I'm sure you also enjoyed the fact that we didn't really give you a lot of help in building those controls. In fact, you could say that the control toolbox for Silverlight 1 was, itty bitty. So we're really excited in Silverlight 2 to actually offer you, some heavy-duty tools. And so in Silverlight 1, what is actually in our control toolbox? Well, in addition to the actual controls themselves that we're shipping and that we're really excited about, we've also got a great control model. And so today we're going to be going deep into this. We're going to be talking about user control and custom control and what the differences are between the two and what the different scenarios are for each of them. We're also going to be talking about how you can customize existing controls and how you do that through either skinning or styling. And finally, we're going to be talking about something new, something called the parts model that Mike mentioned briefly yesterday in the overview talk. And that's just a way for us to kind of make that whole skinning experience a lot better. So I've got a lot of content today. I'm going to try to get through all of it. But it does mean that I'd like to ask for everyone to be able to hold their questions until the very end. So cool? So the first thing we're going to talk about is user control. But before we really get into it, I'd like to talk a little bit about the motivation for user control. So you can see up here the app from Scott's keynote yesterday, of course, the Olympics application. And you can imagine for a moment how painful this application would be if it was one single page of XAML and one single page of code behind. Just not really realistic, right? What you really want is a way for you to kind of split out some of the XAML and some of the logic and kind of break it out both for just code manageability and also to be able to kind of develop the application with multiple people in parallel. So that's one motivation for user control. The other motivation for user control is kind of around reuse. So you can see up here another screenshot from the Olympics demo, the Olympics application. And this is the 10 most watched videos of the day. And if I click on any one of these videos, it's going to pop out to the front, give me a little bit of a border, and ask me if I want to watch the video. Well, you can imagine, of course, copying and pasting that code 10 times on the page. And again, that's just not realistic. What you really want is a way for you to kind of encapsulate each one of these into a control and then just new it up 10 times on your page. So that, of course, leads us to user control. User control, if you're familiar with ASP.NET or WinForms or Windows Presentation Foundation, user control should be a familiar concept. It's a way for you to bundle up some visuals and some code into a little package that enables you both to split up a large application to smaller pieces and also to have kind of what we call cheesy reuse. So to create a control that's not infinitely extensible or necessarily even really well encapsulated, but something that's just easy for you to create and then use multiple times in your application. So how do you create a user control in Silverlight 2? The way you do that is in your XAML page, you actually put user control as your root element, and then put your visuals inside of it. You also have to specify what the name of your user control is, of course, and you use that you do that in the XAML by using that X class tag. And then in your code behind, what you do is you subclass user control with a partial class, and you put all your logic in there. Now, this is kind of the standard operating procedure, but if for some reason you don't want to use XAML, you don't have to. You can new up all your visuals and code and then programmatically set it to the usercontrol.content property, if that's something that you're interested in. So before we see user control up close and personal, a couple tidbits. For those of you who played with Alpha 1.1, user control in Silverlight 2 is actually just the same as Alpha 1.1's control class, except that we're doing all the hookup to the XAML for you, so you don't have to explicitly call initialize from XAML. The second trivia point is that you can use anything that you are used to putting on a page, you can actually use inside of a user control. And that's because a page is actually just another user control. So all the goodies that you're used to, visual elements, data binding, events, tabbing, all that just works inside of a user control. So let's see a demo. And by the way, when I grow behind here, it's because I'm on like the moral equivalent of the granny and the phone book and the station wagon, so that you can actually see me. Anyways. Yes, I'm short. Okay, let's see if I can get this guy. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this application just to get an idea of what we're doing. This is a little bit of a typo as I typed there. This is one of my favorite places on the web. It's the checkout page for the shopping cart. And you can see up here I've got a basic label, which I must have just hit a couple keys on, but it should be the shipping address. And then I've got an address entry form. So I've got a couple of text blocks and a couple of text boxes. And what we're eventually going to do is we're going to split out this section into a separate user control. So let's go ahead and get started. Correct that. Okay, so inside of my XAML, you can see here's my page. It is, like we talked about, a user control. Inside of it, I've got a stack panel. I've got a text block with that shipping address. And then I've got a border with the entire kind of address entry portion of my application. You can see I've got some text boxes and some text boxes down here. And finally, down here, I have a button. And so we're eventually going to move that into a user control, that middle section of XAML. But first, I want to add a little bit of logic just to make it a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to use this little app that I have here on the right with my snippets, just so I'm not typing up here. And I'm going to drag in a key down event hookup. Now, that might not seem all that exciting to you, but for those of you most of you, who've already played with Silverlight 1, you notice that in Silverlight 1, you couldn't handle key down events at the element level. You could only handle them at the application level. And so we're really excited to be able to kind of offer this sort of behavior in Silverlight 2. So here I'm hooking up the key down event. I'm going to go into my page.xaml.cs and drag in here an event handler. Okay. So you can see in this method I've got key event args. And then inside of here I'm able to get to the key that was just pressed. And I'm able to use this handy little enum to really easily figure out what key is actually being pressed, so I don't have to memorize key codes or anything like that. And what I'm doing overall in this method is I'm saying, okay, if I press a Control K inside of my little address entry area, I want to auto-populate to the Microsoft address. And if I instead hit a Control U, I want to auto-populate with the Venetian. So that's just a little bit of logic to make our app more interesting. You can also see here that I'm not actually directly setting the text box properties, the text in the text boxes. I'm actually creating an address data object, which just has here a couple different properties. And again, I don't want to go deep into data binding, but just to let you know that this is what I'm doing behind the scenes. I'm creating a data object and then actually setting the data context for this app. So let's go ahead and run this. And you can see I hit Control K, Control U, and just like you expect, we get that auto-populate behavior. So the next thing I want to do, I want to add just one more event handler. I'm going to hook up the got_focus event. And then I'm going to go down here and add another event handler. Okay. And all this guy is doing is saying, you know, if what's getting focused inside of this grid is a text box, please select the entire text of that text box. And that's going to just help us see what's going on a little bit easier. So if I go in here and press Control K, I now can, just like that, tab through these text boxes. A text box in Silverlight 2 automatically knows that it needs to be a tab stop, and so all the tabbing behavior just works out of the box like you would expect. If I wanted to, I could, of course, customize this further. I could add tab indexes or specify the exact type of tab navigation that I want. But again, for this purposes, this is more than enough. Okay, so we now have our app. We have a little bit of logic. Let's make this thing into a user control. So I'm going to go to my Solution Explorer and add a new item. I actually get the option to create a Silverlight user control up here. And so I'm going to call this address control. So VS automatically creates for me a user control, address.xaml, and you can see I've got user control up as the root element. And so I'm going to go into my page.xaml and grab that border with our address entry. Just copy and paste it. And then I'm going to go do the same thing for my logic. So grabbing from page.xaml.cs and copy and pasting this into addresscontrol.xaml.cs. Okay, now I'm going to do a couple more things. In addresscontrol.xaml, VS automatically specifies that this user control should be a width of 400 and a height of 300, but I don't want to hard code that in this case. I want my user control to take up as much space as it needs to, so depending on what I put into the user control and what layout container I actually end up putting it into. So I'm going to go ahead and just not explicitly set a width and height. And then in my page.xaml, I'm going to go ahead and add our user control to our page. So I'm going to add in a custom namespace. And this just allows the parser to know where to go find our address control. And I'm going to drag in an address control. And again, it's using that C: namespace that we just defined. So let's go ahead and run this thing. And you can see we now have an app after 10 minutes that looks exactly like it did in the very beginning. You know, always a great demo, way to wow the crowd, right? But you can see that our logic still works, our tabbing still works. And so we've created a user control. Let's go ahead and add one more user control to the page, just again stress that reuse point. So I'm going to add in a margin here to my first user control, and then add a second one. And rerun this. And now what I can do is I can say, okay, shipping address, I'm going to ship to the Venetian. I can tab down, and notice tabbing between the controls works just like you would expect. And I'm going to go ahead and bill it to Microsoft. Uncle Bill. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to the PowerPoint. So in that user control demo, you saw that we talked a little bit about tabbing and focus. And so I do want to make a point to talk about accessibility right now. In Silverlight 2, we do have full keyboard accessibility. That means full tab navigation support, like we talked about, and also full focus support. So for focus, that means that I can both request to be a tab stop. I can request to grab focus. I have events to determine whether or not I have focus or not. And then I can also determine which element on the page has focus at that moment. Now with these two, I can also implement my own directional navigation if that's what I want to do, and if that's what makes sense for my control. In Silverlight Beta 2, we're also going to be getting a lot more stuff around accessibility. We have enhanced screen reader support coming using a technology called UI automation. Now, Mark Rideout, one of our PMs on the Silverlight team, has actually recorded a video going in depth into this, and it's going to be posted on the MIX link. And I unfortunately don't have the link for you today, but I will go ahead and blog about that later, and I'm sure we'll get it out to you somehow. The final point is that for those of you who care a lot about full 508 compliance, and if it's important to you and your users, then there is still some additional work that you need to do to get full 508 compliance. And a good example of this is high contrast. So that's our accessibility support. We're really excited about that, and hopefully you are too. Okay, so we started off talking about user control, and we saw how user control is a great way to bundle some logic and some code together in really a fixed way, in a really tightly integrated way. For some scenarios, though, that might not be exactly what you want. You might want to be able to have a much firmer line between the control logic and control visuals, and that would then enable you to make modifications to the visuals without having to modify or touch the code logic. And we do this through something called a custom control. Now, custom controls, because we have that fine logic, the distinction between the logic and visuals, it does mean that, like I said, it's easy for us to customize an existing custom control. And in Silverlight, there's two different ways for us to do that. Something called styling and something called skinning. And we're going to go ahead and talk about styling first. Okay, so for those of you who are familiar with CSS or even style inside of WPF, then the scenarios around styling, property bag styling, should be very familiar to you. It's where you want to take your control and just tweak a couple minor visual characteristics about it. So maybe you want to change the foreground color or the font italicsness or the font size or something in that realm. This is a great scenario for property bag styling. In Silverlight, there are two different ways to accomplish this. The first is probably the most obvious. You can go ahead and on your control set the background property, set the foreground property, set the font family property. And of course that works, but it gets to be a little tedious and is not the greatest if you're trying to style a bunch of different controls. So the second method that we offer for property bag styling in Silverlight 2 is the style element. And the style element is a property bag that you can apply to multiple instances of a control. And we'll go ahead and look at that now. Okay, so I'm going to close our user control demo and open up my second project. Okay. And then let's go ahead and run this guy again to see what we're working with. So here's my really simplistic application. It actually looks a lot like my last one, but this time we're going to make this thing look good. So let's get started. So inside of my page.xaml, we've again got a user control at the top. I've got a border and a grid and a couple text blocks and text boxes. But I'm going to go ahead and leave page.xaml alone for a moment, and I want to look in the second XAML page that VS creates for us, and that's actually app.xaml. Now the application class, there we go. The application class is a great way for me to stick things that I want to be able to access at the application-wide level. And the part of it that I want to talk about now specifically is the application.resources area. Now, the application resource dictionary, so this thing, is a place for me to place a resource. And what a resource is it's a XAML asset that I can define once and then use multiple times throughout my application. So great examples of this might be a brush, maybe even an int, and styles and templates like we're about to talk about. So let me go ahead and get started and drag in here a style. So here's my style element. It's called style, like you would expect. It's actually targeting a text block, and I specify that using the target type property. And then inside of here, I've got a bunch of setters. And the great thing about setters is they do exactly what you would think they do. They say, okay, please set this property, font family, to be this value. And in this case, this value is a font that I stole from my friend, Robbie Ingebretson. And then you can see that all the other setters do something similar. I've got a property, setting the property font size to be 35. I'm setting the margin to have a lower bound of 20. And I'm setting the horizontal alignment to be center and the font weight to be bold. The other thing that you might notice about this style element is that I've specified an : key for that. And that's because everything inside of my resource dictionary, I need to have some way to grab it later. And I do that by providing a unique key for it. So let's go ahead and use the style object that we just created. I'm going to go back into my page. And inside of my text blocks that has the title, I'm going to drag in here, setting the style property. And the way I'm setting the style property is using something called a static resource reference. And again, this just grabs the resource that we just defined at parse time and hooks it up to the property. And so I'm setting a static resource reference to the title style. So if I run this, you'll see that the app is making baby steps right now to looking a little bit better. Cool. So let's make this a little bit more complete. I'm going to drag in here a few more styles. So I've got 3 more styles here, a label style, a text box style, and a background style. And I'm going to hook these up to my page. So I'm going to drag in the label style to this text block, and then drag the same label style into my second text block, and so on. And finally, I'm going to set the background style to this border that's up here at the top. And so just like that, when I run this guy, our app is starting to look pretty good. It's on the edge of cool, shall we say. Of course, this button is still kind of problematic. I love the default skins that we shipped with for Silverlight 2, but in the context of this application, it just doesn't quite fit. And so we're going to fix that in a moment. But first, we're going to head back to our slides. Okay. So that was our style demo. We saw that resources are a way for you to define in XAML an asset that you'd like to use throughout your application. And we saw the style element, where style really is just a property bag, a list of properties with a list of their corresponding values that you can apply to controls, to text, to shapes, and really to anything that derives from framework elements. For those of you who are familiar with WPF style, I do want to make a couple call-outs here. The first is that in Silverlight 2, we have sort of a write once behavior for our style property, which means that you can set it once, but you're not able to clear it or to actually apply a new style to it. The second call-out is that we do not support application-level styles, which means there's no way for you to define a style in one place and have it by default be applied to, say, all the buttons inside of your application. And the third one is that based-on styles are not supported. And a based-on style is, again, just a way for you to specify or extend an existing style by adding in a couple more setters. We think that these are all great features, and they're definitely on our horizon. But for Silverlight 2, we just didn't think that they quite fit into that time frame. Again, that is something that we'd like your feedback on. So if you feel strongly about it, we do want to hear about it. Okay, so did I hear something? So that's styling. And now I want to talk about kind of the other half of this diagram and talk about skinning. So for styling, we saw that it was really easy using a style to just tweak minor visual characteristics. So change the colors or change the font or something in that realm. But in a lot of cases, what you want is something much more drastic. You don't want to tweak the existing look. You actually want to replace the existing look. And so this is our kind of skinning scenario, where you want to replace the skin of the control. And the way you do this in Silverlight is via something called a control template. And a control template is just a way for me to define what the visuals for a control should be. So let's go back to our app. Okay, so I've got in here, remember that not so pleasing button for our application. So instead of dragging into my app.xaml another style, I'm now going to drag in another control template. Okay, or a control template. And again, this control template is where I'm going to define the visual look of my control. So I've got a control template. I'm saying this control template is for buttons. And inside of it, I can place whatever visuals I want. So in this case, I've got a grid where I've set the background property to be dark gray. And then I've also got a text block. So let's go ahead and hook this guy up. I'm going to go back into my page.saml and drag in here, setting the template property. Again, I'm using a static resource reference to that template resource, that control template resource that we just defined. And now when I run this, you can see that our app is starting to look pretty good. At least I'm feeling good about it. but not quite perfect yet, because you can notice that button, it kind of fades out in the context of the application. It actually almost looks disabled. What I really want that button to do is pop out a little bit more. So I think I want a darker color for it. So there would be a couple different ways for me to do this. One is, of course, I could go back to our grid and directly just set it to be black. But what I really want to be able to do is on this button directly, just be able to say, hey, I want this background of this button to be black. And so now I need to do something in the control template to actually pick up the fact that my button's background should be black. So if I go into my control template, instead of hard-coding my grid to be dark gray, I'm going to actually drag in here something called a template binding. And what a template binding is it's just a way to hook up the control's visuals with the properties on the control itself. So here I'm saying I want the background of my grid inside of my control template to be the same as the background of my button. So template bind it to the background of the button. Now when I run this, should all start coming together. Okay, so I'm feeling pretty good about our app, and I think it looks really edgy as far as being kind of black and white and angular. But maybe that's not what I want. Maybe I want to change it up. Well, because I defined all of our styles and our templates inside of the app.xaml, it's really easy for me to actually change what is in my app.xaml. So if I actually go in here and delete this whole thing, I can drag in a different app.xaml with a different set of styles and a different set of templates. And if I rerun this, because my application, my page.xaml actually referenced directly into the app.xaml resources, I've got a completely different look just like that, which I think looks pretty cool. And I can do that one more time just to kind of drive it home, and also because I spent time making both of these, and then I couldn't pick which one, so indulging me a little bit. But you can see that we went from being angular to being kind of deco to being very bold and futuristic and orange just by switching in and out the app.xaml. So cool. Okay. So that was our skinning demo. We saw, again, that control template is just a way for you to define the visuals of the control in a single place. And that template binding is a great way for you to link the visuals of the control with the visuals of the control template with the properties on the control itself. So that's great. We talked about skinning, and we talked about styling, and how you can customize an existing control. But there will be cases where the controls that you have at your disposal don't actually solve the things that you want them to solve. And so it may be the case that you need to build up a new custom control from scratch. So why would you do that? Why would you create a custom control over, say, a user control? Well, custom control is really targeted at the scenario where you have a piece of custom logic that you want to make it to a control. But then you want to be able to allow a designer at a later point to really customize the look of that. And that works really well for a custom control, and it doesn't work quite as well for a user control. So if that's your scenario, the custom control is what you want to use. Inside of Silverlight 2, the way you do this is you derive from the control class, and then you specify a built-in look for that control, or a built-in style. I do kind of like the step up kind of thing. Anyways. Okay, so I'm going to open up my custom control solution. And you can see that I've already kind of started rolling on this for us. I'm creating an image control. And I've specified two different properties inside of my image control. You can see that image control, like we talked about, derives from control. And I've specified a frame brush property of type brush and a source property of type image control, or image source. What you might also notice is that these things are backed by something called a dependency property. And I don't want to go into dependency properties here, but I just want to call out the fact that if you are creating a new control and you want a particular property to either be template bindable or stylable or data bindable, it does need to be backed by a dependency property. Okay, so here's our image control. I'm going to go into page.xaml, and like we've done before, drag in a new custom namespace so that I can access that image control, and then drag in our actual image control and go ahead and run it. And we get nothing. Oh no. Okay, so obviously I kind of did that on purpose, and not just to make myself look, kind of awkward up here. But really, what I want to drive home is the fact that if you define a custom control and you don't specify what it should look like by default, this is what it's going to look like. So remember to define a default look for your control. And the way that we do this, I can go into my Solution Explorer, and you can see I've got my image control defined in this sample controls assembly. I need to add something called generic.xaml. So generic.xaml is something that our platform is going to be looking for. It we'll be looking for it as not a regular XAML page, but actually as a resource compiled into the assembly. So I need to explicitly state here, don't build this as a Silverlight page, please build it as a resource, and I'm going to remove this custom tool build action. Okay, so I've defined my generic.xaml. Now let me go ahead and make it work. So inside of generic.xaml, I'm going to drag in a resource dictionary. Again, this is a resource dictionary just like application.resources was a resource dictionary. It's a place where I can specify the different resources that I want. So I'm going to drag in here a custom namespace again. As well as my built-in style. My snippet manager is a little tired. It's getting a little crabby. Okay, so here's my built-in style for the image control. You can see it's a style like the other styles that we saw. It's targeting an image control, and it's setting the frame brush to be by default black. One other thing that you might notice up here that's different from the other styles is the fact that I haven't actually specified an X:" key. And that's because, again, generic.xaml is a little bit special. And the way we'll be looking for the built-in style for the image control is by actually examining the target type. So let's expand on this built-in style. And I'm going to actually now set the template property using a style. Now, of course, that makes sense if you think about it, that the template is just another property on the control. So, of course, I should be able to set it through a style. But sometimes that kind of just needs to be called out explicitly. So I'm using a style again to set the template property. I specified a control template here. And I'm going to go ahead and drag in a border. And that border is going to be the frame for my image control. And you can see I'm template binding the border brush to that frame brush that we defined. And then I'm going to drag in here an image, just like that, and go ahead and run it. So now when I run it, my control by default actually has a look to it. Very exciting. Okay. So that wasn't a super complex custom control, obviously, but we're going to go ahead and play with this a little bit more. And I wanted to go ahead and keep it simple just so that we can really wrap our heads around it. Okay. So again, when you're creating your own custom control, remember that you need a subclass control. And then you do need to provide a generic.xaml resource dictionary that's included in the controls DLL as a resource. And inside of it is where you should define the built-in style or the default look for your control. Okay. So like we said, our image control, not super complex, but you can imagine that as things get a little bit more complicated and a little bit more sophisticated, that it starts to be a little bit more challenging for the template designer to know exactly what needs to be put inside of the template. So, you know, the template designer is just trying to do their best here, but they're guessing. So wouldn't it be great, instead of the control template designer just trying to figure it out, wouldn't it be great if the control logic actually said, you know what, template designer, these are the things that I would like you to put in your control template. I'd like you to put in a root element. I'd like you to define what the control should look like in the mouse over state, in the press state, in the normal state, and so on. And because that's explicit then, it's much more easier for the control template designer to go ahead and say, okay, no problem. Here's your root element, here's your press state, and so on. And so because kind of with that motivation, we're introducing something new, something that we're very excited about and that we think has a lot of power, and that is, of course, the parts model. The goals around the parts model is, one, just to kind of clearly define and give a clear recommendation on how you should structure your control. And in doing that, we hope to keep that well-defined separation between logic and visuals,